Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229, and this is for Wednesday, November 13th, where we are talking about Dracula, putting some closure onto that, and moving forward to H.P. Lovecraft. And for today's attendance question, what I'm going to ask you to do is to identify a quote in Dracula. I, however, wanted to share a couple of quotes that I think are relevant in terms of our understanding the text. Also, in terms of paper number one, if you have returned, or if you submitted, I should say, paper number one by the due date, I should have returned it to you by this point. So if you submitted it by the due date and have not received it, please let me know. As you know, you all have the option of doing a revision. So what I've done is I've put a good number of comments in terms of grammar and mechanics as well as content. Hopefully you can read my handwriting. I'm very well aware you may not be able to do so. So if that is indeed the case, please let me know and I will be happy to decipher for you. And once you've reviewed my commentary, if it turns out that you would like to get a higher grade, and that would be for anything under an A, you can't get higher than an A, but for an A minus and below, just take my comments into account. And if you need further direction, please make an appointment with me so that we could talk about that. And I ask that you submit in your revision along with the original copy that has my commentary on it so that I can compare and contrast the two. You'd get the higher of the two grades. And you have up until the ending of the semester to submit that. So you've got some time to really think about it. And our second paper, which will be due at the ending of the semester, will be basically the same as the first paper. The distinction would be that you would be writing about a different text. So for paper number one, you were writing about one of the earlier texts in the semester. For paper number two, you'd be writing about one of the later texts in the semester. And of course, you can always create your own essay topic. It just needs to be based on one of the texts that we've examined in class, and you need to have the topic approved by me ahead of time. So, in terms of your discussion forum questions, as you can see, I've fallen a little bit behind in responding to you with discussion forum questions, but I will be catching up in the next week or so. I will also be working on those papers that I received after the due date to get those back to you as well. So, in terms of Dracula, one of the things that makes this text so iconic is that it helps to establish the criteria of what's become basically common knowledge for the vampire. And if you were using the edition of the text that I had ordered for us in class, on page 245 or so, we're told a little bit about vampire and Dracula folklore. He's known everywhere that men have been. In old Greece and old Rome. He flourished in Germany all over, in France and India. And of course, we've got Van Helsing who's speaking. So Van Helsing is speaking in broken English because Van Helsing is a foreigner. And he tells us a little bit that the vampire can live on and cannot die by the mere passing of time. He can flourish when that he fatten on the blood of the living. Even more, we've seen amongst us that he can even grow younger, that his vital faculties grew strenuous and seem as though they refresh themselves. But he cannot flourish without this diet. He eat not as others. Even friend Jonathan, who lived with him for weeks, did not see him eat ever. He throws no shadow. He make in the mirror no reflect, again as Jonathan observed. He has the strength of many of his hand. Witness again Jonathan when he shut the door against the wolves, and when he helped him from the diligence too. He can transform himself to wolf, as we gather from the ship arrival in Whitby, when he tear open the dog. And he can be as a bat, as Madame Mina saw him on the window at Whitby, and as friend John saw him fly from this so near house, and as my friend Quincy saw him at the window of Miss Lucy. He come in mist which he create, that noble ship captain proved him of this. But from what we know, the distance he can make this mist is limited, and can only be round himself. He come on moonlight rays as elemental dust, as again Jonathan saw those sisters in the castle of Dracula. He becomes so small. We ourselves saw Miss Mina, ere she was at peace, slip through a hairbreadth space at the tomb door. He can, when once he find his way, come out from anything or into anything, no matter how close it be bound or even fused up with fire. Solder, you call it. He can see in the dark, no small power this, in a world which is one half shut from the light. Ah, but hear me though. He can do all these things, yet he is not free. Nay, he is even more prisoner than the slave of the galley, than the madman in his cell. He cannot go where he lists. He who is not of nature has yet to obey some of nature's laws. Why? We know not. And of course, Van Helsing continues on about how the vampire's power ceases at the coming of day. Only at certain times he can have limited freedom. If he not be at the place whither he is bound, he can only change himself at noon or at exact sunrise or sunset. These things we are told, and in this record of ours we have proof by inference. Thus, whereas he can do as he will within his limit, when he have his earth home, his coffin home, his hell home, the place unhallowed, as we saw when he went to the grave of the suicide at Whitby. Still at other times he can only change when the time come. It is said, too, that he can only pass running water at the slack or the flood of the tide. And there are things which so afflict him that he has no power, as the garlic we know of, and for things sacred, as this symbol, my crucifix, that was amongst us even now when we resolve. To them he is nothing, but in their presence he take his place far off and silent, with respect. There are others too, which I shall tell you of, lest in our seeking we may need them. The branch of the wild rose on his coffin, keep him that he move not from it. A sacred bullet fired into the coffin, kill him, so that he be true dead. And as for the stake through him, we know already of its peace and the cut off head that giveth rest. We've seen it with our own eyes. And then he goes on and he talks a little bit about the Draculas themselves and how they were a great and noble race. So, again, what seems to be common knowledge was not necessarily common knowledge at the time, and Dracula helped to bring that forth as common knowledge. Of course, there's lots of different ways to read Dracula, and Dracula is a wonderful symbol for many of the ills that plague society. And we were talking about how the Victorian period was known for repression and that they viewed sexuality as a kind of ill. And that said, having a text that addresses sexuality without directly addressing sexuality would have been of great interest to Victorian readers. And for me, again, in the version of the text that I had ordered for us on page 46, this is very early on when Jonathan is being attacked by the three female vampires. And notice that Dracula is able to control those three females. He's quite angry that they've taken it upon themselves without getting Dracula's permission. So gender is also an interesting idea in this particular text. But I wanted to focus on the episode where the three vampires are going to attack Jonathan, that it could be read as a kind of erotica for this time period. And in page 46, Jonathan is saying that they came close to me and looked at me for some time, then whispered together. Two were dark, with high noses like the Count, and great dark piercing eyes that seemed to be almost red when contrasted with the pale yellow moon. The other was fair as can be, with great wavy masses of golden hair and eyes like pale sapphires. I seemed somehow to know her face, and to know it in connection with some dreamy fear, but I could not recollect it at the moment. How or where? All three had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing and at the same time some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. It's not good to note this down, lest some day it should meet Mina's eyes and cause her pain. But it is the truth. And they whispered together, and then all three of them laughed, such a silvery musical laugh, but as hard as though the sound never could have come through the softness of human lips. It was like the intolerable tingling sweetness of water glasses when played on by a cunning hand. And then some of the dialogue. He is young and strong. There are kisses for us all, is what one of the female vampires says. Go on, you are first, and we shall follow. Yours is the right to begin. I lay quiet, looking out under my eyelashes in the agony of delight, in delightful anticipation. The fair girl advanced and bent over me till I could feel the movement of her breath upon me. Sweet it was in one sense, honey sweet, and sent the same tingling through the nerves as her voice, but with a bitter underlying the sweet, a bitter offensiveness as one smells in blood. I was afraid to raise my eyelids, but looked down and saw perfectly under the lashes. The girl went on her knees and bent over me, simply gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive. And as she arched her back, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white, sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head as the lips went below the range of my mouth and chin and seemed about to fasten on my throat. Then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her teeth and lips and feel the hot breath on my neck. Then the skin in my throat began to tingle as one's flesh does when the hand that is to tickle it approaches it nearer, nearer. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of the lips on the supersensitive skin of my throat and the hard dents of two sharp teeth, just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in an ecstasy and waited with a beating heart. So I'm curious to see what quotations you come up with. Those were two rather lengthy quotations, but I think they illustrate some of the ways that Dracula has become so iconic in our society. And in terms of our syllabus, we're a little bit behind because I needed to miss a class because I wasn't feeling well. My apologies, but we will catch up. And as you know, Dracula is the longest text of the semester, so that ultimately we are now transitioning over into more contemporary pieces. Starting with H.P. Lovecraft. You remember that we had talked a little bit about Lovecraft at the beginning of the semester in his very iconic essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, which influenced many Gothic writers and horror writers, including Stephen King. And just knowing a little bit about Lovecraft is helpful in terms of understanding some of his writings. He was in poor health and had a family history of dementia. He is from Rhode Island and oftentimes would write about New England decadence. Remember, we talked about the Gothic tradition having its origins in Europe, England, and basically this is the New England, the oldest part of the country. Most of his stories are shorter stories, and they were published in Weird Tales magazine. And he became a cult figure after his death, which is not uncommon in terms of artists. There's a sense of realism about his writing. He's the only author that we can definitively say that doesn't offer us ambiguity. Up until this point in the semester, all of the authors that we've read have given us some ambiguity, so we don't necessarily have to accept a supernatural explanation. We could accept, let's say, a psychological explanation. Not Lovecraft. The monsters are real in Lovecraft. Certainly they can be read as symbols and metaphors, but they are also literal as well. And he's basically created a mythic kind of universe. So if you are a fan of something like Lord of the Rings, you know that too has created a mythic kind of universe. So his perhaps most famous monster is Cthulhu. And it should be something that can't necessarily be pronounced with the human tongue. So that's the closest that one could get to pronunciation of it. And it's this monstrosity that looks like this deformed sea creature. I suppose an octopus might be the closest that we might have in our old world. He oftentimes talks about the ocean as well as outer space having supernatural and mythical elements associated with them. He mentions a very important university in New England that ranks much like Harvard and Yale, and that is known as Miskatonic University. And again, giving enough realistic details with the geography and locale in New England that one would think that Miskatonic University actually exists, as well as the Necronomicon, which is supposed to be this magical book of spells about how to summon demons that would be housed in libraries of Miskatonic University as well as other areas. In fact, there's so much realism associated with his storytelling that it's mythic for individuals to try to find a real copy of the Necronomicon, even though, of course, it's fictional. Very much preoccupied with age, with old things, with astronomy. So, very much the skies as well as the ocean. And was very anti foreign. Honestly, he was xenophobic. And that is one of the negatives and problems with Lovecraft. I can say that towards the ending of Lovecraft's career, he began to re examine some of his prejudice and xenophobic attitudes. But you can certainly see them in his writing, which is very male centric. And the narrators usually are scientists or scholars. Um, and what we've got is a mixture of Gothic elements, but also science fiction elements. We talked a little bit about genre blending at the beginning of the class and how easy it is to move from science fiction, something that could be explained through scientific means, to something like supernatural fiction, that which defies natural explanation. We talked about that with Frankenstein, for instance. Very much a fan of Edgar Allan Poe, and Poe inspired many of his writings. Um, and of course, in supernatural horror and literature, Lovecraft had determined, some of the elements that makes a piece of writing um, considered to be an excellent piece in supernatural circles. And I guess part of the question is whether or not we think that Lovecraft can live up to his own criteria. He's known for having twist endings. And in fact, one of the things he tends to do is to put his twist ending in italics. You can't miss it at that point. You will see lots of prose rhythms. There's almost a poetic sense to some of his writing. Lots of dramatic tension, lots of foreshadowing. And I selected just a few stories to illustrate some of his writings that we'll talk a little bit about next class. The first is entitled The Outsider, and it's one of my favorite stories because it deals with the metaphorical idea of what does it mean to be the other, that which is different. Pickman's model, and that links the supernatural with the artistic world. If we had had time, we would have read The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a wonderful Gothic piece, but there is a long tradition of linking art with access into the otherworldly. And the Dunwich Horror. The Dunwich Horror happens to be one of the stories that lays out that mythic world that I was talking about with Cthulhu and Miskatonic University and the Necronomicon. So those pieces we'll talk about next class. And that means that we will be able to transition over to a ghost story. Now, we had talked about the English ghost story for a Halloween class. This is a ghost story written by Shirley Jackson. She was very well aware of the British tradition of subtlety and ambiguity in the ghost story when she created her own, perhaps the most famous or one of the most famous ghost stories of the Gothic tradition is The Haunting of Hill House. And I've luckily been able to find free links for the Lovecraft stories that we're going to be reading, as well as The Haunting of Hill House. So you can see that in the notes below that I've included that. But of course, I've ordered the text for the class as well. And you might know Shirley Jackson for a very famous short story she wrote called The Lottery, which is oftentimes studied in introductory composition classes. And let's just say this is a lottery that you don't want to win. I'll let you just sort of contemplate that idea. And if you haven't read the short story, I encourage you to do so. In terms of thinking about where we are with the semester, in addition to your discussion forum question, which would be due on the 17th, where I'm asking you to identify a quote that you think is important in Dracula and indicate why. Again, you're not necessarily required to respond to your peers, but certainly you're encouraged to do so. What you are required to do is to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. And of course, I will be catching up in the next week or so with any discussion forum responses that are outstanding, as well as any of the papers that were submitted to me after the due date. As I put it, students are in the queue, so to speak. So I evaluate the papers in the order of receipt. And then at that point, I can start reading revisions because I have started to get a few revisions. But you've got up until the ending of the semester in which to do that. So last class, and it seems like it was ages ago because Monday, as you know, was Veterans Day, so we did not meet. That I had wanted to show you, or at least offer you, another parody. As you know, the parody that we saw of The Simpsons of the Monkey's Paw was in relation to our class about the English ghost story and Halloween. For Halloween, one of the things I did was I was at the Lava Center, which is in downtown Greenfield, and I and my husband actually performed a parody that I wrote of The Raven. And The Raven, of course, being Edgar Allan Poe's most famous work. That said, you're not required to watch it. There won't be any element of it associated with a paper or final exam. But if you would like to see it, I guess it's about 10 minutes or so, and I've included the link below in the third section. So this is how I spent part of my Halloween. And I hope you enjoy it for those of you who do decide to listen to the parody. Again, your attendance form discussion question due Friday. If you need an extension, please let me know. Identify a quote that you think is important in Dracula and indicate why. And next class, we'll talk some more specifically about, well, Lovecraft. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.